Welcome to this Great American Layouts edition of the Dream Plan Build video series. We're traveling the country, touring the modern railroad empires of America's most talented modelers, and giving you a chance to hear their insight and modeling know-how firsthand. From incredible lifelike scenery to the remarkably detailed structures and rolling stock, get ready for new inspiration for your dream layout. Now settle in and enjoy your behind-the-scenes tour of America's top model railroads in this Great American Layouts edition of the Dream Plan Build video series.
Welcome to your tour of the Denver and Rio Grande's Silverton Branch Railroad. My name is Doug Tagsold, and this is my ON3 scale layout. I guess you could say I've been a model railroader all of my life. Both my father and grandfather were train enthusiasts, and many of my earliest childhood memories are of running Lionel trains, both in our basement and my grandparents' basements. Over the years, I've built numerous HO scale layouts, and 5 years ago, when a space became available for a second layout, I thought I wanted to try something different. A family vacation to Colorado and riding the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge convinced me that trying a narrow gauge layout and doing it in O scale would be something very interesting and challenging. We're going to take a tour of the layout, and I'll show you some of the techniques that I've learned along the way. Hopefully you'll come up with some new ideas or techniques that you can use on your railroads. When the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was first chartered, its intentions were to run south from Denver across the Rio Grande River to Mexico City. But when gold was discovered in the mountains, it turned its attention westward and started building branch lines into the mountains. When the line to Durango arrived in 1891, it immediately started building north, and by 1892 had reached the Silverton area. Though the mines were not producing much gold, they were shipping out silver by the ton. The 1890s were a very prosperous time for the railroad and for the mines in the Silverton area. But when the United States government stopped purchasing the silver in the early 1900s to back its currency, the freight traffic on the Silverton branch began to dwindle to the point where by the late 1940s and early 1950s, it was down to only 1 or 2 trains a week traveling the line. Tourism was just starting to become a very big business in Colorado in the mid-1950s. Several Hollywood movies filmed in the Durango-Silverton area, the Jimmy Stewart movie Night Passage, Ticket to Tomahawk, and then in the 1960s, the Paul Newman, Robert Redford movie, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So through these movies, the public became very aware of the beautiful scenery and started flocking to southwest Colorado to ride the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge and experience a day in this mountain majesty. The Rio Grande was not interested in being a tourist railroad operator and filed to abandon the line. Local business people in both Durango and Silverton were able to convince the Colorado state government that the railroad was a viable part of their economic future and forced the railroad to continue to operate the line. In 1968, the Rio Grande did receive permission to abandon the line coming from Denver and Chama to Durango from the east, but it was required to continue the isolated Durango to Silverton branch. In 1982, the Rio Grande sold the branch line to Florida citrus grower Charles Bradshaw. His intentions were to keep the Rio Grande Silverton branch in operation as a museum and a way for tourists to experience the lifestyles of the late 1800s. The locomotives used on today's Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railroad are the original Denver and Rio Grande locomotives that were purchased in the early 1900s. They have been completely restored and maintained in the shops in Durango by the D&S crews. Before I started construction on the layout, I gave a lot of thought to the style of operation I wanted to have and had that influence the design. And what I mean by that was, I wanted to have the towns visually separated from each other, so the crews with the timetable train order operation would have to rely on the paperwork they had at hand, their timetable and their written orders, to determine if they had the right to proceed to the next town. I also took in consideration the history of the line and also the general atmosphere that a narrow gauge railroad has. And what I mean by that is a slow-paced operation with only a few trains running. I wanted this layout to be an easy layout for new people to learn timetable and train order operation and not feel the pressure of dozens of trains heading down the main line at 100 miles an hour. So let's go over to Durango and start our tour of the layout. We're going to start our tour in Durango. Now, before the railroad built into the region of southwest Colorado, there was no town of Durango. And rather than laying their tracks into the existing town of Animas City, the railroad decided to stop short about 2 miles and put in their engine facilities and a new rail yard. They then laid out a map with city streets for a new town which they named Durango, and then offered the citizens of Animas City the chance to buy property in the new railroad town at a highly inflated price. Engine number 268, a Class C16 locomotive, is the Durango yard switcher today. Its first work is to build the Silverton Freight. The roundhouse is actually a model of the Ridgway, Colorado roundhouse. Made some modifications to it and painted it to match the color of the Durango roundhouse, which still exists today. Bringing out engine number 464. This will be the power for the Silverton freight train. The turntable on the layout is actually an HO scale turntable made by Diamond Scale. Made some modifications to the bridge to make it more appropriate for an O scale turntable. Now that the engine has been turned, it backs to the coaling tower for a full load of coal. The coaling tower is also a kit. This is a model of the Chama, New Mexico coaling tower on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. The Durango coaling tower was very similar, so I was very happy to use this as a stand-in for the actual Durango coaling tower. Next to the coaling tower is the sand house. This too was a kit made by San Juan Engineering. Engine 464 is backed up to the water tank for a full load of water. The amount of water in the tank will get the engine as far as Needleton, where its next water stop will be. The water tank in Durango has a switch machine made by Tortoise mounted inside the tank. The switch machine lever powers the spout on the tank, raising and lowering it. Both the water tank and the coaling tower have sound modules made by Miller Models to represent the authentic sounds coming from these structures. The Silverton freight will run to Silverton as extra number 464. The train is not a scheduled train, it's not on the timetable, it runs as an extra train, and its number is the engine number. The Durango station is probably my favorite structure on the layout. I used plans that I obtained from the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado to build this structure. It is made out of styrene and also uses grant-lined window and door castings. Kits made by several different manufacturers were used to model the downtown Durango area on this layout. All the kits have been weathered a little bit. Looking down the downtown streets of Durango, you'll see some buildings in the background, and these are just false front buildings that are only a half to an inch deep. But as you look at them down the street, it adds a lot of depth to the scene without taking up very much space. We have the Strader Hotel, which was established in 1882 and is still in operation today. A very nice, elegant Victorian-style hotel. Inside several of the structures in the Durango area, I have included photographs taken of interior of several of these buildings. So when you look inside the windows, you can see the actual interior of some of these buildings. And in one of the stores, I've even included cutouts of myself and my wife and friends Rand and Karen Hood standing inside the building. Using the photographs inside is a very easy way to add detail to the inside of the building with minimal effort. As we leave Durango and approach the Animas River, you see the river is lined with a lot of trees. Most of these trees I have handmade, and we can give you a chance to see how I did that now. Many of the trees on the layout I've made myself. Some of them are commercial made, but to do the deciduous trees and especially aspen trees, I needed to make my own. And to do those, I use this, it's called sugar bush. It's available at just about any craft store. And it's relatively inexpensive. Unfortunately, we're going to throw away most of it. To make a tree, I simply clip off the bottom portion. This is going to be disposed of. But here's the beginning of a tree. Pull away some of the smaller branches. For O scale, the trees are going to be anywhere from 6 to 8 or 10 inches tall. And about all I have to do to this sugar bush is remove some of these bigger leaves off of the branches and just simply pluck them away. Okay, I've got all the leaves pulled off of that piece. I'm going to start on a second one now. Probably take 3 or 4 of these. We'll clump them together to make our final tree. Not too worried about what these individual pieces look like right now. When we put them together, we can kind of pull off some branches if there's something sticking out of the way that doesn't look too good. That one's pretty good. Here's one more. Set that aside. I'll do one more here. I'm going to make this one a little shorter so it'll kind of fill in the bottom of the tree a little bit. Okay, now I'll put the 3 pieces together, kind of hold them together at the bottom of the trunk. Yeah, that's kind of sticking out there. Kind of turn them around a little bit till you get it shaped into the shape of what you want your tree to look like. That's not bad right there. What I do next to hold it all together then is just take some masking tape, peel off a piece here a few inches long, and start at the bottom and start wrapping it around the trunk. Don't want to put a whole lot of tape on here, because as you put more on, the trunk starts to get thicker and bigger around, and we don't want to have it to be too big. And there's basically the tree. What I do before I do any painting, I found that the masking tape with time might tend to start unraveling. So I'll just put a little bit of Elmer's glue on it, a little bit into the branches so it drips down inside the tape, but then just kind of coat the tape, kind of seals it. And then just set it aside and start on the next one. After the glue is dried, I'll paint the trunk with a kind of maybe a mixture of a charcoal, black, gray, a little bit of brown. A lot of people think of tree trunks as being brown. Well, if you look out at the real world, you don't see very many brown tree trunks. They're usually more of a blackish gray color. But pretty much any color in that range will work. And I just, with a small brush, just paint the trunk and go up and get some of the bigger branches up in the tree, but I don't worry about getting the very small ones when you get up close to the leaves, because you're really probably not even going to notice it. And after that's painted, I like to give the whole tree a light dusting of instant weather. It's an aerosol paint. It tones down the green. The sugar bush is a little too bright, and it also blends in the color of the branches, the brown, to hide it, and gives the tree a more natural weathered look. As you see, this tree only took a couple minutes to make. If it was going to be a foreground tree, I might spend a little more time being a little more concerned with getting the branches placed right. But for a background tree, you can make dozens of trees in a relatively short period of time. It's going to make a nice looking forest or wooded area on your layout. So let's go back to the layout and continue with our tour. The three bridges that you see here were originally all wooden structures, but a fire destroyed two sections of the bridge, and those two sections were replaced with a steel girder and a steel truss bridge. To model the center truss bridge, I used an HO scale Central Valley bridge. Had to modify it a little bit to increase the width and height, but it provided nice parts to use to scratch build, or to at least kit bash the structure. To model the river, I used the tried and true method of Envirotex, but to give it the look of moving water, after the water had settled and cured hard, I applied clear silicone on, dabbling it on with a small brush in a fan-like pattern to create the ripples to look like the water is moving across the surface. After crossing the Animas River Bridge, the train turns the corner and comes into Hermosa. Our freight's going to stop here, set out a tank car at the oil facility, and pick up the boxcar at the team track. Hermosa is located about 10 miles north of Durango at the north end of the Animas River Valley. My representation of Hermosa is a little bit different than what the actual town is. I've added an oil well and loading facility, which actually did not exist in Hermosa, but it gave me a chance to put some of the Gramps tank cars on the layout. For those of you that don't know what the Gramps tank cars are, the story behind that is one of the oil shippers in Colorado was standing by trackside watching a train go by with his grandchildren, and one of the grandchildren asked, "Grandpa, is that your oil in the tank car?" Well, Grandpa said he didn't know, but from that point on, he made sure that all the tank cars that hauled his oil had Gramps written on the side, so whenever his grandchildren saw Gramps on the tank car, they knew it was Grandpa's oil. The water tower in Hermosa still stands today. It is unoperable at this time. The station I built using pictures, old photographs of the original station. It now has been dismantled. In the current Hermosa, this area is used as a storage area for parts and equipment for the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railroad. Leaving Hermosa, the main line starts up a 2% grade uphill to Rockwood. On the way, it passes behind Shalona Lake. After visiting the Shalona Lake area on the real Durango and Silverton, I knew that this was an area I wanted to include on the layout. The view of the blue water beside the rock cliffs and the trees were just too pretty to pass up. To model the lake, I used the Envirotex. But before I poured the Envirotex, I first painted the base of the lake a flat black color just to represent depth, and then feathered it out to a little bit of blue around the edges, and then poured the Envirotex with just a tint of blue added to that to also add to the blue color. I did not put any waves in this lake because it's pretty well protected, surrounded by mountains, so there's very little wind effect on this lake. The pine trees in the Shalona Lake area are all commercially made pine trees available from quite a few different manufacturers. I chose trees from several different manufacturers, so the trees had a different look to them. Not all are the same shape or size. And a lot of them I did a little airbrushing just to tone down the green color and add a little more natural look to them. Back in the mid to late 1800s, Rockwood was a very important transportation town. There were a lot of lumber mills in the area, but there were also a lot of stagecoach lines that ran up into the mountains to the various mining camps. Prior to the railroad's arrival, the stagecoach lines were the main means of transporting the minerals out of the mountains. Looking at my model of Rockwood, we'll see that the trees here have started to change. These are some of the same trees that I scratch built, but you see the trunks are now white. We're up at a little higher elevation, and now we're seeing a lot of aspen trees. At this elevation they're still green, but up higher in the mountains they've started turning yellow and orange. My model of the sawmill here at Rockwood was scratch built. The sides are left open so you can see the table with the saw blade and several pieces of lumber that have been cut. And to do the roof, I used heavy aluminum foil. To make the corrugated shapes, I dragged the foil over a piece of corrugated styrene and then laid the pieces onto the roof. And you see I did the same thing on the small maintenance shed. And to tone down the shininess of the foil, I weathered it first with a coat of dull coat paint and then used some real fine dirt and chalks to weather the roof. The Silverton freight rounds the curve and comes into the passing siding here at Rockwood. The train stops in the siding, cuts the rear end of the train off, and spots the flat car with the new International Farmall tractor at the team track. We've got a furniture manufacturer here in town also, using some of the wood products made by the sawmill. And next to that we have the team track. After setting out the flat car, the engine pulls ahead and then backs onto its train. One modification I made to the station was adding the working train order board. The train order board is a way to signal trains, telling them if they have to stop to pick up new orders. If the blade is in the lowered position, a train can proceed without stopping at the station. But if the board is in the horizontal raised position, no train may proceed past that board without stopping and going inside and talking to the agent and picking up new orders. As it looks ahead at the station, it sees that the train order board has been set to the stop position, so the crew walks up to the station to see the agent and pick up its new orders. Extra 464 West has received orders stating that it will meet Extra 463 East here at Rockwood, so the train remains here in the siding in the clear for the meet. Extra 463 East appears out of the Rockwood cut and proceeds through the town of Rockwood, meeting Extra 464 waiting in the siding. After the meet with Extra 463 East, Extra 464 West proceeds west towards Tacoma. After leaving Rockwood, Extra 464 West traverses through the High Line area on its way to Tacoma. Building the railroad through the High Line portion of the 45-mile Silverton branch was the most difficult construction on the line. Railroad crews had to blast a narrow ledge out of the mountainside to form a right-of-way to lay the tracks. Trains coming out of Rockwood into the High Line area find themselves all of a sudden 400 feet straight above the Animas River. Several years ago on a family vacation to this area, my wife and I and our two kids walked out into the High Line area, and they're represented here on the layout. My wife and daughter are shown here near the curve, while my son and I walked further ahead and up above the tracks in the distance. Building this portion of the layout was by far the most time-consuming portion. My son and I spent nearly 6 months working on the plaster and carving the rocks. We started first by modeling the mountains behind the tracks. The mountains were formed up and the rock carving done in this portion, and the scenery pretty much finished. Then we started the foreground from the tracks down to the river bottom nearly at the floor. To represent the water at the bottom of the canyon, I used the same techniques using Envirotex as I did at Shalona Lake. But to show the moving water on the top of the Envirotex, I added some clear latex caulk, dabbled to show the ripples of the moving water. Prior to building this portion of the layout, I had very little experience in carving rocks. But over the 6 months' time of working in this area, I developed some techniques that I'd like to show you now. For doing the mountainous scenery I've always preferred the old tried and true method of screen wire supported by some wood structure. Sometimes I'll wad up some newspaper to help hold the shape, but the reason I like the screen wire is I can actually form it and get it pretty much into the shape that I want it to be finished in, so you can actually, as you're working with it, see what the finished result's going to look like. And then over the screen wire, I'm going to cover it with this plaster impregnated gauze. This is a lot neater, not nearly as messy as mixing up plaster and dipping newspaper like we used to do it. And we'll give it a try here. I've got some pieces already cut. And I just use an old paint roller pan. Just dip the gauze in the water at the deep end, kind of drag it to the shallow end to let the excess water run off. Then I just start laying it over the screen wire, smoothing it out. Overlapping the pieces, an inch or two a little bit. And any wrinkles or anything are real easy to smooth right out. I start at the base or the bottom of the mountain and work my way up. That way the gauze on the lower portion will help support the screen wire and support the weight of the gauze in the water as you work your way up, so it doesn't distort the shape of the screen wire. The pieces I'm using right now are fairly large. They're about 6 or 8 inches square. I've also got some smaller pieces cut when we get around to the edges where I won't need such a large piece, so you don't waste too much material. And this material, it works real good even on the area where I'm working right now, the screen wire. It's almost vertical, but the wetted gauze has like a cling effect to the screen wire, so it don't have to worry about it sliding down. I'm not concerned with getting a perfect finish with the gauze because most of this is going to be covered up either with scenery material or with plaster. When we get to this more vertical area here, we're going to apply some plaster in a little bit and carve some rocks. So this is basically just the support to support the plaster that we're going to be applying later. There, we've got the screen wires all covered, and now we're just going to set this aside for a little while, let it dry before we do the plaster rock work. But already you can get an idea of what the finished piece is going to look like, and I think that's one of the things I like most about the hobby of model railroading is doing the scenery, because the finished results are very obvious very quickly. You can take a railroad that's just bare bench work, and with a few minutes or hours worth of time roughing in the scenery, you instantly have a good look at what the finished railroad's going to look like. Now that our plaster is set up just about firm now, we're ready to apply some thick plaster and do some rock carving. For that, I use a combination of plaster of Paris, and one thing I do that might be a little different is I add sandbox sand to it. I mix it about 50-50. Adding the sand to the plaster gives the plaster a little more texture, so when you start pulling away chunks of plaster, you have a more coarse, stone-like finish left to it. Some of the tools I'll be using is a big 2-inch wide putty knife. This is just for applying the wet plaster onto the module. A couple knives for carving the rocks, and a brush for knocking some of the loose pieces of plaster away. Okay, we've got some plaster mixed up here, so let's start applying it. I'm going to use my big 2-inch putty knife, and there's no neat way to do this. Don't worry about trying to get any good-looking results. It's just a case of putting it on like you're putting thick frosting on a cake. I'm putting it in the area where the module, where the mountain is most vertical, because that's naturally where you would have the side of the mountain has fallen away and you'd have these exposed rocks Along the top edge of where I'm applying the plaster, I want to match the slope of the mountain so it doesn't look like these rocks are all of a sudden just jutting out from a more level surface, but yet that the mountain's more continuous and then it just drops off. Don't have to get it too thick, but I like to vary the thickness. Some areas this plaster might only be a ½ inch to an inch thick. But I want to have a couple spots where it comes out a couple inches. It'll give me a little chance to do some more dramatic outcroppings. Might have to wait just a minute for it to start setting up a little bit. What I'm going to do first is start putting some horizontal lines. They don't have to necessarily be horizontal, but you want to pretty much keep all the lines going the same direction, whether you have a little bit of angle to them or not, but you don't want to start doing crisscrossing because most rock outcroppings do not look that way. Plaster's still a little bit soft, so a lot of these marks I'm putting in are disappearing. But it doesn't hurt to keep going because once the plaster starts to set up, you do have a limited amount of time to work with it, 5 or 10 minutes or so, so it doesn't hurt to get a little head start with it. I'm going to start knocking away some of the pieces that are sticking out that just don't look natural. And I'm going to put a few vertical cuts in here, kind of separating these different areas, give it a little more rugged look to it. Here's where it's nice to have a little bit of thickness to the plaster to give you the option to do this. Almost looks like there'd be some drainage here, water running down the mountain causing a natural crack or groove in the rock here, so I'm just going to exaggerate that a little bit. It's starting to set up a little bit now where we can actually start doing a little more detailed work. With all these grooves in here, now I can start going in and just start pulling away little pieces of it where time, erosion has, the rock has broken away, giving it a little more of an irregular look. Nothing scientific about it. It's kind of fun to play with. I started using rock molds and found that the time it took to mix up the plaster, put it in the mold, and then stand there holding the molds in place, I could get a lot more scenery done faster doing it this way. And I like the results a little better too because you didn't have the uniform look of the rock mold outcroppings because they tend to repeat each other after a while. And knock out a big chunk here. I'm going to go to the smaller tool to get in here a little deeper. You want to look for areas that still show where it's kind of smooth. Eventually I want to get most of all that smooth area of the wet plaster knocked off. So again, it shows the sand that's mixed in the plaster and a more coarse, rough look instead of the smooth, watery look on the edges. These little pieces that are falling off to the side or down to the bottom are kind of a good thing. You don't want to, some of it's going to get swept away when we brush it in a few minutes, but you want to leave some of it because it looks natural as the real mountainside is eroded away. These pieces are going to accumulate down at the bottom, and I'll take away some of it, but leaving some of it there looks natural. These are the rocks that have fallen, and it's almost a continuous thing. Any nighttime when there's a thunderstorm out in the mountains, Go out in the morning, you'll see new rocks that have come down that have washed away off of the mountainside. I'm going to take the brush just to knock some of this loose stuff away and get a little better idea of what we're looking at here. And this also rounds off some of the sharp edges. You can see that I've worked in an area, about one square foot area, and that's about the most you can work, most area you can work in one time. Otherwise the plaster is going to start setting up on you before you can get to every area. Okay, we've got this area just about done. I've got two choices here. I could go ahead and mix up a little more plaster and fill in this area here. But let's skip ahead and let's just add some color to this rock outcropping now. I'm going to start adding color by applying wood stain to the rock. I like using wood stain because it's a fairly dark color that'll soak down deep into the cracks, giving a good shadow effect. Now at first it's going to look a little dark, but as it starts to settle into the cracks, the outer areas will lighten up. But it really helps bring out the detail of the rock work. The other thing I like about using wood stain is it dries very fast. And being a petroleum-based product, it doesn't mix with the water-based latex paint that we're going to be applying on the rest of the mountain, so you can kind of get some dramatic effects with the combination of the two materials. While we give the stain a chance to soak in on the rock work, let's go ahead with our latex paint and start coloring the rest of the mountain. I like to use a real light colored paint for the base of my western Rocky Mountain scenery. It tends to be real sandy. Most of this isn't going to show when we're finished anyway, but it makes a good base color. To add a little more color to the rocks, I'm going to use my paint, but I'm going to dip the brush in some water to dilute it so it's putting on a very thin wash of color, kind of like the stain was. Now here's where you see that the water-based paint and the oil-based stain do not mix. They tend to repel each other. And at first it doesn't look real good, but as it dries, it gives a nice effect, adding a little more color. And then the areas of the rock that stick out the most, these you can kind of just dab a little paint on to highlight them, because these are the areas where the sun is going to be hitting them a little more intensely, so they're going to naturally be a little lighter in color. While the paint is still wet, let's go ahead and add a little ground foam onto the mountain. You can start to get an idea of what it's going to look like finished. A lot of it's going to fall to the bottom. That's all right. And of course, before we are completely finished, we would spray it down with some diluted glue to set it permanently, but the wet paint temporarily will hold it in place. And where some of it falls onto the rocks, that's all right, because even on these rock outcroppings, on the horizontal surfaces where plants can actually grab a foothold into the rock, there will be some vegetation growing. And one thing I think that's very important with the ground cover is to use different colors. When you look at a mountain from a distance, you might see the gray or tan of the rocks, and you see green vegetation. Well, as you get in closer, it's not just one color green. It's a lot of different colors of green. I think the scenery looks a lot better and the colors pop when you add a more variety of color. Some of these areas, we'll just kind of pat it down to get it to stick better. And then this is a blended turf. It's kind of a neutral color, a little bit of a brown and tan. I like to sprinkle this on, and this kind of blends the two areas of the rock work and then the more level part of the mountain. Blends the two colors in so you don't have a sharp contrast in colors where they meet. Okay, well, you can see what the rock work is going to look like now. As it dries, it'll become a little more duller flat finish, which will look more natural. And this is the same technique that I used when I modeled the High Line on my model railroad, except this took about 10 minutes. I think I spent more like 6 months doing the High Line. But anyway, the technique is the same. So let's go back to the railroad. Between the High Line and the town of Tacoma, the Rio Grande main line passes over the Animas River. In this area, the river's dropping quite rapidly, so I wasn't able to use the EnviroText that would flow right off the edge of the layout. So instead I used 3 different colors of silicone caulk. The blue caulk is an automotive caulk used for forming gaskets. And then on top of that I used clear silicone and then a little bit of white to show the ripples of the water cascading down the stream. To model the bridge here, I used another Central Valley HO scale kit and turned it upside down to represent the high bridge here at Tacoma. Coming into Tacoma, we passed by the small passenger station and the electric power plant behind it. To model the passenger station, I used photographs of the original little depot and scratch built it. The electric power plant here at Tacoma receives water that is piped down from high in the mountains from Electra Lake high above it. To model the building, I used a kit that was a pretty close representation of the building, and I added a few little details to it, such as the pipes coming out of the bottom with the water flowing out. To model this water, I again used the clear silicone caulk with a little bit of white dabbled on it to give it the appearance of the water flowing out of the pipes down into the Animas River stream. After the silicone started to set up, I was able to tease it and pull it back up into the pipes so it would remain in shape, looking like water coming out of the pipes. There's a few company houses here in Tacoma, and these are where the people that work in the power plant live. Their only access to the outside world is by the railroad. Extra 464 West, the Silverton Freight, takes the siding here at Tacoma. The train crew has looked at the timetable and sees that the returning Silverton excursion is due back into Tacoma at 1:45 p.m. Extra 464 West will wait here in the siding for the meet. With the main line now clear, Extra 464 continues west towards Needleton Tank and Silverton. The Needleton Tank area on the layout is probably my favorite part of the layout. is the area that I think is the most beautiful on the Durango and Silverton ride, and the area that I wanted to recreate as prototypically as possible. At this higher elevation in the San Juan Mountains, the aspen trees have started turning yellow and gold. After riding on the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge through this area in late September when the aspen trees were yellow, I knew that I wanted to try to recreate this on the layout. The main line runs parallel to the Animas River here through the Needleton area. All trains are required to stop here at Needleton Tank for water. Just like the water tank at Durango, the Needleton tank has a spout that raises and lowers, and the sound effects of flowing water. Just before coming into Silverton, the main line passes through an area called the Narrows, where the space between the mountains on either side of the river was barely wide enough to fit the railroad through. Here you'll see more examples of some of my rock carving, and behind it, the photographic backdrops. You may have noticed that I've used a lot of photographic backdrops on this layout. Let me show you some ways that you can add those to yours. I like to use a lot of my own photographs for the backdrops on the railroad, and people will ask me, well, how do you do that? Well, it's simply a case of going to the location that you want to shoot and finding an observation point where you can see the scene without having too many obstacles in the way, like telephone poles or buildings. Here's a couple shots that I've shot out in Colorado and had the prints processed, and we're going to piece them together to take a look at what the backdrop's going to look like. I look for identifiable objects in the pictures, like here we've got two little trees, and here's the same two trees here, so it kind of helps me line the pictures up. Here we'll use that little stone there as a reference. And here we've got a larger stone. And once the pictures are all together, now with this series of 6, I can think about how big of an area I want to have for the backdrop. These can be enlarged to poster-sized prints, either 20 by 30 or 24 by 36. Most photo labs offer various sizes like those. So looking at this, if these were enlarged to 24 by 36, each print is going to be roughly 2.5 feet. So with this series of photos, I've got 12 to 14 feet of backdrop available. Here's a couple of the prints that have been blown up into poster-sized enlargements. So these are 24 by 36 inches. And we'll slide them apart here. And here you see we've got the same trees on both pictures, so that'll be our reference point for lining these up. Right about there. So here's how these two pictures are going to look together. I'm not concerned about having the bottom of the pictures line up because before I install these, I'll be cutting the bottom portion of the picture off. And I'll also be cutting out the sky. It's hard to get the seam in the sky to be invisible, so I'll just cut along the top edge of the mountain, not worrying about cutting around every individual tree. You could spend a lifetime doing that. To hide the straight edge, after these photos are installed on the wall, I'll just use a little bit of white glue and dab little pieces of ground foam on the top edge that'll represent the top of these trees to give it the irregular look. If you're not able to go to the area that you want to photograph for your backdrop, there are commercial-made backdrops available. One of the nice things about the commercial backdrops is you can get them made up to 12 feet long, so you don't have to worry about splicing the individual pictures together. I've used a combination of both on my layout, my photographs and the commercial made. So let's go back to the layout now and see how they look there. As we approach Silverton, you'll see some of the commercial-made photographic backdrops that I've used on the layout. To add extra depth to the scene, I've used different sizes of trees. In the foreground, the trees are anywhere from 6, 8, 10 inches tall, and in the background, they're much shorter, only 2 or 3 inches tall. The line I'm modeling ends here at the town of Silverton. On the real Denver and Rio Grande Western, the main line ended just past the Silverton station. There was a Y that was used to turn the engines, heading them back towards Durango. I wasn't able to fit the Y in on my layout. If I would have done that, I would have lost several of the sidings that I wanted to have available for setting out cars. So instead I added a balloon track for turning the engines. Extra 464 West arrives into Silverton and stops at the station. The train crew will go inside and talk to the agent to discuss the switching moves that it needs to make. My model of the Silverton station was scratch-built using plans of the original building. I did not try to model any of the specific buildings in Silverton. Instead, I just used a collection of kit and scratch-built structures to represent the downtown Silverton area. Most of the streets in Silverton remain dirt today. If you took the vehicles out of town, it would look much like it did 100 years ago. Many of the colored signs on the buildings were obtained and printed off of the internet. I simply printed them on plain white paper and glued them to the side of the buildings, and then used a variety of chalks and dirt to weather the buildings. To represent the grassy area here in Silverton, I used a material called plush felt obtained from a fabric store. It was simply just laid onto the plywood below it and glued down, and then sprayed with several different colors of different shades of yellows and green to add a little more variety to the color, and then the dirt and ground foam was just added on top of it. A couple of the buildings here in Silverton were named after friends. The Stratton Feed Mill was named after a friend that has served several duties over in Iraq, and I wanted to honor him by naming the building after him. Another of my friend's father owned a lumberyard, so in honor of him, I named my lumberyard in Silverton after his. In the fall season, local ranchers will ship their livestock out of Silverton by rail. To represent this on my layout, I scratch-built a stockyard here in Silverton that is equipped with authentic sounds. One of the reasons I wanted to try modeling a larger scale was to build some of these much larger buildings. The North Star Mill here in Silverton is by far the largest structure on the layout. The real North Star Mill was the last mill that was in operation, shipping out ore in Silverton. On the other side of town at the North Star Mill, we find engine 478 coupled onto a string of gondolas ready to head back to Durango. Thank you for joining us on the tour of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Silverton Branch Railroad. We've traveled from Durango to Silverton and back, and I'm hoping that you've come away with a little better idea of what operations were like on that line during the 1950s. I also hope that maybe you've learned a few new techniques or some ideas that you can take home and use on your layouts. But just remember, keep it fun.
Thank you for watching this Great American Layouts edition of the Dream Plan Build video series. Look for future Great American Layout editions as together we explore more of America's greatest model railroads.